A cyber attack happened. We contained it. It didn't affect your business, but these things are not going to be available for the next few hours while we fight it. If that's going to be the future, then what we're saying, it's a big shift from what we think today. Most leaders think if there's a cyber attack, I have a business continuity plan. That's going to recover me 15-20% of my business. But where I'm headed is that I'm saying that you define a minimum viable digital business, which will be 80%, and you invoke your BCP for the 20% affected part. Most people think, and I think you also alluded to it while you were talking about, is most people think that their crown jewels are, let's say, the SAP server and stuff like that. But really, what happens to the CEO's laptop? That's a crown jewel too, right? And how do you protect that? The browser is very, very important. And in a world where browsers are going to go on the cloud and work, there's another problem that we are not talking about, and that those are non-human identities. Unless people are bringing cyber defense onto the mainstay, it's going to be a big problem, because when you have new technology, they need access. People don't understand. You reminded me of something that happened about 25 years ago. And I was auditing a deployment, and I found that they were so hyper-focused on giving access that they completely forgot about removing access. And when I audited that system, I think they had 843 identities, and they had 120 people.
Imagine you're sitting in a boardroom and the CEO has just asked you to explain why the company needs to invest in defending against a breach that might never happen. That's been Agnidipta Sarkar's world for 30 years. He's our guest today, and he's the chief evangelist at ColorTokens. Agni is a firm believer in the zero trust approach. Instead of just trying to keep attackers out, he helps companies prepare for what they can do when they actually get in. He calls it breach-ready cyber defense. Agni, thanks for joining us on the Be Fearless podcast.
Thank you so much, and I'm happy to be here. It's great talking to you, John.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your career evolution. You started out as a hands-on CISO, right? And now you've become an evangelist. What drove you to step into this evangelizing and thought leadership role?
I started off actually as an auditor, and then I joined sales. Then I became a consultant for some time. Then I went back inside. I started helping build enterprise defenses. But after some time, I realized that whatever that I was doing, and I was visiting these events and I was talking at events, and I realized that there are things that I'm doing that others also need to know. And there came a time that I realized that there are things that I've built, frameworks. I participate in standards. I am part of 3 ISO mirror committees. I contribute to Cloud Security Alliance. In fact, CCM version 4 is a standard that I've contributed to, Cloud Control Matrix version 4. And I continue to participate in many other standards. In fact, as we speak, I'm actually working on finalizing a new standard for digital resilience in Bureau of Indian Standards, which probably will get, I don't know yet, but I'm hoping it'll be proposed to ISO for adoption. But that, it takes time. So when I do all these things, I'm building standards, I'm writing frameworks, I realized there is a lot that I can do with others when I met other practitioners and CISOs. And the other thing that happened is I have had some very nice experience with the board and very bad experience with the boards. And I realized that's one problem that I can contribute to, because boards, people who get on boards, get overwhelmed sometimes with the technology jargon that goes around. And at the same time, the technology and risk leaders who come on the board get put off by the lack of knowledge or the insensitivity to their cause. And that's a problem that I've seen in many enterprises, and it's not isolated to one. I've also seen that there are line of business leaders who are constantly dissatisfied with how IT works. IT is dissatisfied how the line of business leaders are not able to understand. They're trying their best to meet the expectations. And I thought there's a gap that I can fulfill. So that's why I am here. And I've also realized that I think this is the truth, that the board is not empowering the CISOs, the line of business leaders, and the CIOs to look more at digital resilience. I mean, we are only evolving to a point where people are saying cybersecurity is a board topic. But in reality, it is not so much about cybersecurity, which is a preventative measure, but it is about how do you prevent the next breach.
I when I got into cybersecurity, I was doing work for the military. They really wanted to have as many preventative measures in place as possible, right? And it was okay that it took a long time for you to deliver technology solutions. And this is, back in the early 2000s, it was slow to deliver technology solutions anyway, between just procurement of hardware being sent to data centers and getting everyone there to plug it in and everything else. It took a long time to deliver technology back then. One of those things that kind of shapes you, or at least shaped me when I was doing that work, is the intolerance for having vulnerabilities in your environment, whether it's a configuration problem or an actual patching problem, and then the processes to get that stuff done. The tolerance really wasn't there in a military environment. I kind of think that what we know about cybersecurity today from a U.S. perspective, a U.S.-centric kind of point of view, was that most of the findings that came around like how to configure systems and that vulnerability was important, that being able to see what's on the wire is important, all these things. I feel like that mostly came out of like military and like DISA and NSA kind of guidelines that were being published in the late 90s and early 2000s that somewhat set up a culture that we believe that a vulnerability is intolerable, and that it's really important that we patch, and it's really important that we do this and we do that. And those technology and risk kind of folks kind of bring that to the board, like, hey, look at how many unpatched systems we have, and look how many of these problems we have, right? And this is not configured correctly, and there's a risk over here and a risk over there. And I think that we've somewhat desensitized the business and the board from understanding what the technology risks are. Because if it was as prevalent or as a problem as it was, then why aren't we breached every day? I mean, if it's such a big problem, why aren't we having breaches constantly? And maybe we are, right? Maybe there's a different problem. And I think that that's been true for some time, that cyber leaders have kind of pushed out this mantra of fear, uncertainty, and doubt into the board, but the board really hasn't seen those risks materialize, not in the frequency that you would expect the boy who cried wolf made it out to be, right? And I think that's problem one, right? That's part of the reason why the board's somewhat desensitized to that. But I think the other part was, you were completely on point with this as well, is that as cybersecurity leaders, we're also not thinking about what's important to the business, right? And I think my mindset on this really started to take a form that was, I think, useful maybe in like 2016, right? I mean, it's been, maybe almost 9-10 years since my mind shift kind of shifted away from FUD and all those kind of activities to maybe the problem isn't, what I'm experiencing when I look at the IT infrastructure, and it's really the outcomes and the impacts that those technology gaps have, right? What I started thinking was that there's two things that I've got to focus on as a CISO or as a security leader. And one is availability management, making sure that the systems are up and running so that the business can transact, and anything that threatens the business transacting is a cybersecurity threat, right? That there's a threat there. What is it that I need to be able to take? And there's, again, some of them are cybersecurity threats, but then there's other threats that could impact a business. And then, of course, the one that we always talk about is confidentiality of data. How do I not get breached, right? That was always the idea. I had some really bad experiences. I had some times where I had just like many breaches that were happening in my environment just because of lack of security controls and, a Fortune 500 company. And I got to the point where my thinking turned into, it wasn't that I was going to prevent all breaches, but it was, how was I going to respond when the breach happened? Right. And it's like, what were the actions I was going to take? Was I going to make it a harder or worse problem for the business that now we have this breach, so now we have to turn off all the systems and shut everything down until we figure out what's going on? And now we have loss of revenue plus reputational damage because everyone knows we're down. Plus, I actually have a regulatory threat, and I have and I don't know how big of a problem that is. There was so much more to unpack, as a senior cybersecurity leader than it was when, I first started getting into it. So my point of view is very much aligned with yours. I kind of said it in a slightly different way.
I'm trying to, skip too much ahead.
Okay.
I'm trying to be more proactive. I know what you're saying. It sort of slowly becomes a pressure cooker situation.
Yeah.
For example, material impact. The SEC's requirement of evaluating material impact in 4 days seemed to be overwhelming when it started off with. Did you know that India has a requirement that you need to report a breach in 6 hours?
I did not know that.
Okay. So when it started, it seemed overwhelming. And it happens because regulation is not keeping up with the cyber attacks. Look at it this way. The investment in cybersecurity is going up, right? And probably in the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to become $1 trillion market. Are cyber attacks coming down? No, they're not. So where should we go? How should we deal with this? And that's why I want to skip the queue, and go at the beginning and talk about how boards should look at it. Should they look at it as a very complex technical problem that they are struggling to handle, or should they look at it as a business problem, which is using technology? And if they ask the right questions, for example, how good are we at, given the current investments, and someone says that I want to create a new digital factory. That's a line of business leader. The question they should be asking the line of business leader, we understand the technology you're talking about. We understand that you want to do something great. We understand your good intent. But tell me, in this new digital system that you're proposing, how likely are we, given our current investments, to be able to anticipate and prepare for the next attack? A. If we are able to anticipate and prepare, and should a cyber attack happen, how likely are we able to contain that attack in a small area while the rest of the business goes on as usual, and eventually withstand it for some time and then recover from it and go about normal business? What is the likelihood? How good are we given the current investments? And the third thing that I need to know is, if we can anticipate well, if we can contain well, or if we cannot anticipate well, cannot contain well, what are the investments we need to evolve to a stage of the expectation, and how much time will it take? These are not technical questions.
I agree.
These are very simple questions, But what happens behind it? And that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to evangelize the fact that the most foundational ability to handle a cyber attack is to understand the environment that you're working in and make it more manageable. I mean, think of Kaizen. Kaizen is a mechanism by which you divide your field into small parts, make sure every small part grows, and then you have an overall growth. So if I take the same concept and I apply it to cyber defense, if I'm able to divide my enterprise into small parts, make sure each small part is defendable by itself, and I have an overall view, a panoptic vision of what my enterprise is, what my assets are. I mean, I'm not getting into the fact we're going to probably discuss the whole day about asset management, I know. But I'm saying if we are able to do all these things and do it granularly, and then have an overall panoptic ability to manage the whole thing, I think we are closer to addressing more cyber attacks than we are today. Because if you read and all the things that are happening across the world, in most cases you'll hear a headline that says we had an unprecedented cyber attack and then we shut down our organization to deal with it, which is why we've got so many losses, and so on and so forth. It's a roller coaster ride after that. But to your earlier point about patch management, one of the learnings that I have had from factories, and as one of my friends says, I have been on the shop floor for some time, is that when you go to OT, they don't look at patch management the way IT does. Because when it comes to IT, it's like, oh, there's a CVE9, let's go fix it. And if you don't fix it, there is FUD, right? There's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Mm-hmm. But on the shop floor, they say, you know what? I can't shut down my machine in 6 months. So we have to find other ways to deal with the vulnerability. And one of the best ways to deal with the vulnerability, which is what ISA 62449 deals with, is to divide your factory into zones and conduits and manage the zones and conduits. So build capability in the ability to disconnect a conduit, plan it in such a way so that you're able to operate the zones without the conduits always working, so that you're able to then defend against a vulnerability. You may not fix the vulnerability, but you may isolate your environment, you may contain the attacks, and so on and so forth. So that's the point of view that I come with.
No, I appreciate it. I think in the telco space, I had similar experiences with managing radios and such. It's like, hey, yeah, we know there's a vulnerability, but you just can't roll out a patch to a bunch of systems that are that people are depending on to make phone calls, emergency services, et cetera. And it's definitely a different mode of operation from an IT department. If we patch a system and it fails, then we might lose revenue, but we're probably not going to lose a life. I think that's kind of the reality for most IT shops. I think in OT and critical infrastructure systems, I think it's a little bit different world.
Yes.
That
they focus on safety, reliability, and efficiency.
Right.
Instead of confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Sure. And yeah, so I think that the reality of the situation is different. And I think that that's one of those concepts that I think cybersecurity leaders tend to not understand, because I think the business and the board, I think they think of a business more like how a manufacturer would think about their plant. I think they think of it more like that than they do as an IT problem, right? They think of it as a revenue is the lifeblood of the business. Anything that threatens revenue, whether it's a regulator or IT outage or something else, those things are actual threats to the business, not necessarily, patching or those cybersecurity practices that we would love to people to adopt and do very well. But I really haven't seen that done super well in most technology companies. I think it's something that lags, even if they intend to. I think it's difficult for them to execute on, right? So I think that kind of moves us into like talking a little bit about zero trust, right, and being breach ready. You focus on the core zero trust standard, NIST 800-207 as the zero trust benchmark. Can you break this down for us and share what are the key zero trust mistakes that you see repeated across in the industry?
So zero trust is actually a theme, or I would say it's a mindset. And I know that you probably have been experiencing this throughout your life as when you were a CISO. And the fact is that, honestly speaking, the first zero trust experience we had was when we configure a firewall, deny all being the first rule, right? And I'm talking about 25 years ago, probably. That's when we first looked at what a checkpoint firewall or IP tables or something like that and said, okay, deny all should be the first one. But we've never taken that down to practice. And that's what happened good in the world. NIST 207 actually says that there are multiple ways in which you can bring in zero trust, though it actually lays out the zero trust architecture theme itself in terms of what it is. And I know many of the audience probably are experts at zero trust. But to your point, if you look at, I think it is 3.1.1 in the standard, which talks about three ways of implementing zero trust, and they're now expanding it to many others, which I'm aware of, are to look at enhanced identity governance through microsegmentation and through software-defined perimeters. Now, if you look at all these three should be the foundational pillars of an enterprise. But what happened is this standard was taken up by many others, and they started building products with the name Zero Trust in it. So you have now a Zero Trust identity, you have a Zero Trust network access, and you have, this just goes on, which actually helped the world a lot because people have gone ahead and adopted a lot of cybersecurity tools only because they wanted to get onto the zero trust bandwagon. That's the good part. So they built a lot of cybersecurity tools, and a lot of cybersecurity companies went and sold a lot of zero trust tools. But what really did not happen was that people did not look at the NIST standard and then said, okay, let's see if I have to buy zero trust to a tool that will help me implement zero trust. Have I done enhanced identity governance, or am I looking at identity primarily from the perspective of what the tool offers me? One of the things that people have not looked at so much favorably is microsegmentation. If you look at the real value of microsegmentation is that it allows you to limit the blast radii of a cyber attack. The moment you put in microsegmentation, as I said earlier, if you're thinking like Kaizen, so this becomes the most foundational capability of the implementing a zero trust. But we don't focus on that because until recently, actually, if I look at even now, most people in the industry are thinking that microsegmentation is a tool to segment your company, an expensive way of doing network segmentation, which it is not really that. It is more of Kaizen of cyber defense. So if you're able to divide your enterprise correctly, and again, there are many ways to divide it. Most people approach it from the perspective of let's do a prod, non-prod separation. Or let's divide the enterprise in terms of the departments we have, or the geolocations that we have, or let's divide it on between data centers and offices and people and so on and so forth. I think we are going about it in a wrong way. And the reason that I'm saying this is because what really needs to happen is people need to focus on an assessment of whether they can be breached or not, and then identify what the crown jewels are. Look, in a world, and I know I'm asking for too much, but in a world where asset management itself is a challenge, doing a perfect analysis of crown jewels is practically impossible, considering that there is existence of shadow IT, shadow SaaS, and then shadow AI. But what can happen is that one of the good things that ISO has brought in is a concept of continuous improvement. So what can really happen is people can look at what they have, define their microsegmentation program on the basis of how do I defend the next attack and what my crown jewels are, and divide them into manageable parts, and then improve it. Because you're not going to fix the problem in one shot, just like you're not going to stop a future cyber attack. And then focus on the fact that what can really happen. Look at what is exposure. One of the things that people don't understand, and I espouse, is called as cyber defense modeling. The way that works is if you're able to visualize that I have an asset that's exposed to access inside and outside the company, and that asset is not so important for me. It is important, but not so important as what that asset connects into. Think of a web server connecting into a database server or an application server. So if the web server goes down, I may have alternate mechanisms to work. But if my database server gets affected, then probably my business is going to get affected because it's not connected to one database server, it's connected to multiple application servers as well. If I look at it that way, if I go and let's say go on a screen that allows me, to actually tap on an asset and say, okay, this is my attack path because I've allowed connections here, and that becomes a huge amount of information that you can have and determine. Remember, I talked earlier about zones and conduits in OT world. You can now start thinking about something similar in the IT world and say, okay, let me divide it into some zones and conduits so that when I understand the attack path, I also understand where can I intercept it. And if I have the mechanism to intercept it, I think I have built my foundational level of cyber defense. So even if there's a cyber attack that happens, if I've got an SIEM that can feed me that a cyber attack is forming, behavior anomalies are indicating that an attack could be happening, I can immediately take preemptive steps and cut out those conduits that need to be cut out so that I am now ready to face the attack and contain it as it happens. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I think that earlier when you were talking about assets, right? What I was thinking, or what first popped in my head, wasn't asset management, like IT trying to figure out what technology they have and where it is. Definitely a problem. I was really thinking about things that were important to the business, that were an actual asset to the business, something that's, you use crown jewels, and I think that's probably a good term. But those are what you want to protect, and I think that there's probably some way of generally speaking, I think the business knows what their revenue drivers are. They know what they're selling, where it's being sold, and whether they have product or they don't have product, right, to sell. I think they know where they're making money. They may not know all the technology systems that are behind that, but there's probably someone in the business that knows that, hey, these are probably some systems that are important to me. And I think that would be a good way of classifying an asset. Is that a worthwhile approach to just thinking about it from the business's point of view, and then kind of, like you said, it's continuous improvement? Maybe this quarter we make some.
That's a very valid point. You need to get ahead of that. What I meant by that is, if, like you said, the business knows where how I'm making money, but that's what the business knows. Then someone, as you said, in the business knows what are the digital systems that are helping me make money. But that guy doesn't know whether those digital systems have what it needs to defend against an attack. That is known only to the technology risk leaders. We're not making those connections. We need to make those connections. So what you are heading upon is absolutely bang on. You need to do a material impact analysis and define what is an acceptable material impact that you can withstand. You need to define what's the minimum viable digital business that you would want to operate. And I say digital business because you know what business you're doing. You know where you're making money, to your point. But you need to make that small connection that's missing, which is what systems are helping me make that money. To your first point, you said availability. What do I need available when a cyber attack happens?
Right.
The ideal world in my mind is a situation where I have, let's say, an artificial intelligence based system that tells me, guess what? A cyber attack happened. We contained it. It didn't affect your business, but these things are not going to be available for the next few hours while we fight it. If that's going to be the future, then what we're saying, it's a big shift from what we think today. Most leaders think, if there's a cyber attack, I have a business continuity plan. That's going to recover me 15-20% of my business. But where I'm headed is that I'm saying that you define a minimum viable digital business, which will be 80%, and you invoke your BCP for the 20% affected part. And now I'm making that huge leap from what could happen. So the headlines are going to change. We had a cyber attack. It was an unprecedented cyber attack, but we were able to contain it. All this part of this much of our business is continually operational, and we have invoked our BCP, we've got the cybersecurity guys, and we're going to fix it and come back very soon. That is a very different headline from, we had a cyber attack and we had to shut down our enterprise, leading us to losses.
Agreed. And I think that, going back to like the SEC regulations and, identifying what is a material impact, I think that's also a very difficult subject for technology leaders and cybersecurity people to manage.
Yes.
I think that, recently I had an experience where we were talking about cybersecurity insurance, right? And one of the people on our team were asking me questions about how long would it take to recover this, and how long would it take to recover that, and how long could we be down before it was a material impact to the business. And those were different kinds of questions that were being asked of me than what you typically hear around the IT shop floor. I think IT generally knows if they have an e-commerce system and it's a technology-driven business, that they know that this e-commerce system is important because that's where revenue is being driven. But in like manufacturing businesses, I think they're a lot more separated from revenue, meaning that the products they're producing, they're being sold into a channel, for example, that are being distributed across the world to go land at a Costco somewhere in the United States or wherever. That's a little bit more difficult for cybersecurity leaders and IT folks to manage because it's more supply chain kind of driven activities.
So let me ask you this. If you had a mechanism that you had done an exercise prior, and you determined what could be the material impact if certain systems were unavailable, before this guy asked you these questions, don't you think it would have been very easy for you to answer, oh, you mean this server, this is the impact. This server, that's the impact. Right. We're not doing that exercise. And it's not rocket science. There's a whole lot of learning in the business continuity world. There's something called the business impact analysis that is done, which is very, very similar to material impact analysis. But there's a knowledge gap. The knowledge gap is that the material impact is not even very clearly defined by the regulation or by the CFO or by anybody else. So it needs a collective effort to sit down and really say, I know my business, I know digital assets affect that, and I know what material impact can happen because my CFO told me it's in so many dollars. And now I'm prioritizing and saying, okay, so I'm going to divide the enterprise into 26 segments based on 26 micro-segments based on material impact and with increasing order. So if the attack happens in Z, then my material impact is highest. If it happens in A, it's the lowest. Yeah. Now I know what to do if there's a cyber attack in C. And that means I need to immediately contain it in C, remove those conduits, and make sure that now I can go and report a material impact within days, not 4 days. I mean, I'm saying it's possible to do it probably in 6 hours like India expects, but
sure.
But I'm saying it's possible, but we need to do that exercise prior. And that needs to involve the line of business leaders, the technology risk leaders, in a workshop driven by an expert who understands both these worlds and is able to connect both of them, not fight, collaborate, so that they're able to reach to the conclusion that this is what it is, and build that intelligence into a zero trust implementation of microsegmentation.
Sure. This approach focuses on being breach ready cyber defense, right?
Yes.
Rather than just trying to prevent breaches, what does it look like in practice? We're kind of talking about material impact, business impact analysis. Let's say zones, because you have zones and conduits. What are the zones, and then what are the conduits between them? And we've touched a little bit around if something happens in this zone, I can disconnect it from 3 other zones, but it has to maintain connection to this other zone because they're more highly coupled, right? I feel like this is part of the breach-ready cyber defense. Am I right? And then what's it?
You are.
How's it look in practice?
The effort that goes on is And if you got me right, and I think I conveyed a message that it's possible to do it. It's just that everyone needs to come together to do it, and it's not rocket science, but it's not simple either. It's not like, okay, press two buttons here and you're done. So there needs to be concerted effort. There needs to be an ability to, let's say, model cyber defenses. To answer your question, what does it look like in practice? It looks like an initiative that involves senior leadership and then goes on to define, put effort to identify the context of cyber defense, then define what could be the points of interception, and then go about implementing, or rather, what I call it, hardening the enterprise. That is making sure that there are no open ports, there are no management communications that are not needed. If the company has a privilege access mechanism, then that's enforced. If they don't have a privilege access mechanism, they can do it through controlled workflows if they want. But it's a lot about hardening, looking at how identities are working, what identity-based communications will happen. All this is hardening. Once the hardening is done, once your microsegmentation is implemented, that is when you start figuring out what playbooks do we need. So that playbooks will define who will do what when if there's a cyber attack. And today, unlike when I was growing up in the industry, there's a huge lot of information available. CISA's website in the US has profiles of attackers. I was actually doing a lot of research on scattered spider recently. So part of my work is actually to profile attackers and to figure out what they're actually doing. It's a very interesting world. If you look at scattered spider is a loosely connected group of attackers, and they choose a vertical. They go about social engineering, get through help desk, and that's how they attack most of Marks and Spencers and Cantas and all that. But if you really look at it, this information is already profiled on the CISA website, and they define how the attack will happen using the MITRE attack framework. So if we know these two things, then all that we need to overlay that information with, and that's where the real workshop should happen in terms of modeling cyber defense, is that where could the attack originate, where could it go, and then define playbooks and train people. So if there is a cyber attack and the SIEM tells you that there is a cyber attack, you let's say whether you succeed in containing it in zone 1 or zone 2, or you didn't succeed in containing it, it is not material, is not important. It's important immediately. Everyone who's of importance should know what they have to do because they planned it, they exercised it, and they're ready for the cyber attack. So that's what it really means on the ground. Because when the cyber attack happens, you really want to be in a situation of command. You need to be in a situation where you say, okay, we know the cyber attack happened through this route, we've contained it, and now everybody goes about their business as usual by following those playbooks and getting into a war room and saying, you know what, we managed to do it, or we didn't manage to do it, we need to do more. That's something that if you practice it over time, you move away from a pressure cooker situation to a situation of, to use a popular term, command and control. That's what it really looks like. And it's not that it's impossible. Some of our customers are already doing parts of it, but it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight, but it needs to be identified as something that's not where you put the CISO at point and say, you need to do it, because he can't do it alone. It needs to be driven down from the boards, driven down through the line of business owners to the technology and risk leadership, and everybody does it together.
Agreed. Let's talk about the modern workplace and the threat landscape some. Today's workforce operates primarily through web browsers for most of their daily tasks. And I think that's just a consequence of cloud adoption, the more and more SaaS apps showing up, people adopting SaaS apps. It's a quick way to kind of deploy new technology, and then browsers become more capable, right? But has that changed your approach on advising organization on cybersecurity strategies? Because I think that most of the time when I'm thinking about micro-segmentation, I'm thinking about data centers and offices. But in today's world, there's a lot more remote workers, almost like this decentralized network for us to operate our businesses on different SaaS apps. I mean, has it changed the approach?
No, it actually gives input to leverage it more. One of the things that microsegmentation must do, or rather cyber defense must focus on, is the ability to integrate different products and different capabilities. The browser, as you correctly pointed out, is today's modern workforce, and that's if there are secure browsers available, if the secure browsers can provide relevant APIs, then they should be used for defining attack surfaces and blast radii. One of the points I missed earlier to tell you, and when we were talking about crown jewels, is most people think, and I think you also alluded to it while you were talking about, is most people think that their crown jewels are, let's say, the SAP server and stuff like that. But really, what happens to the CEO's laptop? That's a crown jewel too, right? And how do you protect that? How do you consider that as part of your overall cyber defense strategy? The browser is very, very important. It's and in a world where browsers are going to go on the cloud and work, there's another problem that we are not talking about, and that those are non-human identities. It's not only the human identity. So there is a browser, there's a non-human identity, and if you've got a foundational layer of microsegmentation in, and if that can pick up the information from how these browsers work and how non-human identities exist, it's far easier to do microsegmentation or to do cyber defense and plan for a world where you are able to figure out, oh, you know what? Agni working from this part of the world is using this kind of stuff that he should not be using. And that means it's time to cut him off, cut out that intercept and cut out that microsegment that he's on and tell him, sorry, you're posing a risk to everyone else. Change your way of working and then we will let you in. We need to get there. We're not there. Not many people are thinking about browsers as an important part of how you plan your cyber defense, but it needs to improve. The world needs to realize that browsers are the most important point of ingress.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that I was looking at the Mandiant report a couple of months ago, and I've talked about this a lot. Definitely would like your point of view is that when I look at the Mandiant report, I count like 60% of the breaches that resulted in Mandiant being engaged that they were reporting about to actually have traversed the browser. It actually, whether it was reusing passwords on a bad site or like you were talking about non-human identities that people don't talk about are like OAuth scopes and OAuth consents that people give to different applications that allow that token to be used forever from some other website into your mail or your Google Drive or whatever it is that you're doing. 60% of those attacks just traverse the browser in some way, or either a human operator started it or human operator took advantage of technology and logged into a new SaaS product, gave unnecessary OAuth scopes like I was talking about. But it's usually something that's happening in the browser that's causing the abuse to happen that results in a breach. I think one of the interesting things about browser security is that it's that decentralization of the network made it so that like the technology we used to use, like proxy servers to control outbound flows and firewall rules to stop people from going in and out of the environments and IDSs and IPSs so that we could inspect traffic. All of that's somewhat like gone away as well. And so we have like a loss of information because of point-to-point encryption between the browser and whatever SaaS service that we're looking at. But in the browser, everything's somewhat clear. It's almost like, for it to render on the browser, it had to be clear. And so there's definitely, I think, opportunities for micro-segmentation, I'll say, of your SaaS apps and your OAuth scopes and such inside the browser as well, so that you can keep information that's supposed to be in your corporate enterprise space, but not allow it to traverse to another SaaS app that you didn't expect your users to come up with.
Yeah, that's so true. In fact, now with AI coming in, I am looking at a spate of AI vendors coming up with their own browsers. Perplexity released a new one. There's a waiting list to get onto the Perplexity browser that they're releasing. And I'm sure that almost every one of the AI powerhouses will try to get in there. And if you really ask me, I am concerned about the fact that there are newer technology areas that are going to coexist with older technology areas. And unless people are bringing cyber defense onto the mainstay, it's going to be a big problem, because when you have new technology, they need access. People don't understand. I'm going back to, you reminded me of something that happened about 25 years ago. And I was auditing a deployment, and I found that they were so hyper focused on giving access that they completely forgot about removing access. And so suppliers would come in and gain access. And those were nice days, because there were when I audited that system, I think they had 843 identities and they had 120 people. So the balance included suppliers who have not, nicely enough, connected again, even though their accesses existed. They could have got onto the VPN, got onto the network, and done anything that they wanted to. But when I asked the teams, and I asked the CEO of that company, how is it that you didn't focus? Finger pointing started. That guy didn't tell me, this guy didn't tell me. But the reality is, no one focuses on that point that you just made. Is it making life easier on the browser? And at the same time, is it a practice that's making you more secure and more, confident of the digital system that you're going to use?
Yeah. I think that, I just did a webinar on browser AI agents, right? And it's another example of a non-human identity being used in your place, right? If you, say that you need to fill out a request for accounts payables or accounts receivables or a payment to somebody, and you get an email and you say, hey, AI agent, just process all my email and, make sure that the accounts are updated appropriately. I mean, it would be easy for someone to have like a business email compromise, trick that AI agent to do that. And then they're using your identity, that browser AI agent is going to use your identity to do that work. It is concerning, right? Because I think that one of the nice things about AI and AI agents is that they're enthusiastic and they really want to help, but they really aren't very discerning in the actions that they take or how they're going about doing the work. They're just executing on it, and in a lot of ways, it's one of the reasons why I think shadow SaaS and shadow IT and shadow AI are so prevalent. Isn't because there's malice in users, right? It's just that they just want to get their job done most expediently. And they think that this set of shadow SaaS tools are going to give them that capability. And so it's a problem, right? But anyway, the latest press about ColorTokens is about your ability to use existing EDR tools to build breach-ready cyber defense. What value does EDR integrations bring to the CISO and to digital resilience?
Multiple. The biggest value is that it's one agent less. So you no longer need a micro-segmentation agent in your enterprise. You can leverage your EDR licenses to do the micro-segmentation and connect them to ColorTokens so that they can actually help you visualize and micro-segment your enterprise. The second advantage is speed. Micro-segmentation traditionally took, the traditional method was that you deploy an agent and then you observe the traffic. We fixed that problem by going proactive in a progressive method and reducing the bad part, the part that I talked about, hardening the enterprise. We were hardening the enterprise. So, about 3 years ago, one of our competitive products used to take 1.5 years to implement. And in some cases, they've not yet implemented. It's been 3 years. We knew about the problem, and we came up with a mechanism so that you're able to reduce it to 90 days. Now with EDR, I think the latest one was a few hours. Yeah, because it's maturity. And it's not only EDR. I mean, ColorTokens is looking at integrating. I talked a lot about integrating with other things, right? So the key is that when you look at your cyber defense strategy as something that's integrating your existing investments, that's where the real value lies, because you're not doing away with that. EDR is something you've invested in. You put in time and effort to get it organized in your enterprise. The difference between EDR and microsegmentation is that EDR is contextless, but it does a fantastic job of detect and respond, or rather detect and kill. Microsegmentation is context based, so it can discern between assets that have got higher value versus assets that have got, or digital systems that don't have that higher value. It can discern between your factories and the cloud and the enterprise IT. I don't know of many technologies that are as pervasive as ColorTokens is, because we bring a single platform to manage any of these possible points of attack. And what we have done now is that we have augmented it with the ability to use an existing EDR and learn from there and build on that. I mean, when I was talking to another CISO and we were discussing this EDR integration thing, he said, "Yeah, I know you guys can do it in a few hours, but you shouldn't be very happy about it. Look at where we are going. I mean, the expectation of the CISO has gone up. Now he's saying it's a few hours technically, yes, but it's going to be a few days, because you and I need to sit down and we need to define how the microsegmentation will really work. And for that, we need time." And I said, yes, the good thing about the technology is it's moved the needle from the technology to the human. Because earlier it was the technology that was getting delayed, because you need to observe. And now you don't need to do that. You just need to implement. And now you have all the information. You're already in an advanced state of defense, because not only you are now able to, that's the other value. EDR gives you detect and respond. It can stop an attack, right? What microsegmentation gives you is the ability to stop the proliferation of the attack, even if the EDR gets bypassed.
Right.
Those are the real values.
Yeah. I think that doing cyber in the military, we did like a micro segmentation project back in like 2011, 2012 timeframe. And it was so manual. I mean, it felt like what we did also, Cisco had a network access control, Cisco NAC, and we implemented that at the same time. So everything had to authenticate onto the network, right? And that felt like years to get that done and working and operating. And then we did the micro segmentation. I think we were using like McAfee Z policy orchestrator to do all the firewall rules and everything else. And the environments were not big. I think we had a lot of endpoints, but with the number of servers we had, we're probably in the hundreds. Right. But today's environments are so sprawling with so many servers, tens of thousands of servers. It seems daunting to think that, you could get micro segmentation done in hours. That's an incredible capability.
Yeah. I think you said the word daunting.
Yeah.
When you look at it from the scale of what can happen in an enterprise, if you can do it in a few hours, it's daunting.
Yeah.
And I think that's where ColorTokens is heading into. We are getting into integrations with multiple technologies, not only EDR, but anything else that can help build and define microsegmentation. We're getting into finer controls in OT if you go to our website, you'll see us partnering with probably some of the top leaders in OT, cybersecurity. You'll see us partnering with leaders in IT, cyber defense, and so on and so forth. So I think the road that we are on, the innovation that the technology is bringing in, and the approach that we are taking to take it to the boards and the senior leadership, and at the same time address the concerns of the technology risk leaders, is going to reap some results.
Yeah, we should have our technology teams talk more. I think we need to figure out how to get browser detection and response that we have into the program as well, and kind of looking at the OAuth scopes and the extension usage and where the data sprawl is happening and the shadow SaaS sprawl is going on. I think that might be an interesting capability.
Absolutely.
You've been working on something called defensible cybersecurity during your time at CMS IT Services. And now you're talking about mission critical assurance using zero trust enforcement, or the MAZE framework. Can you explain how these differ from the approach most organizations are taking?
Defensible cybersecurity was an approach for cybersecurity, because at that time I was helping organizations build their cybersecurity stack. So it was more focused on looking at a slew of technologies that, if combined together, can make your enterprise more defensible. It was not so much about cyber defense. It was more about cybersecurity, because it was not just one technology. Like, it was not MFA alone, but MFA combined with something else. So that was a time where enterprises were looking at one single technology option when it came to cybersecurity. But where we talked about where defensible cybersecurity was going, it was trying to take it to the level where you're looking at the whole thing holistically. But MAZE, or mission critical assurance using zero trust enforcement, is much deeper into digital resilience, because it focuses on how do you provide assurance that your mission critical systems are going to operate by using zero trust as an underlying layer, as an underlying commitment. So this is more on digital resilience than defensible cybersecurity. But as I said earlier, that I've dabbled in frameworks. I work with standards, and so that's been the clarity that I have had with being on boards. And now I'm focusing on how do I educate all the three levels, the boards, the line of business leaders, and technology and risk leaders, to make sure that they are able to build mission critical systems that they can assure to their stakeholders.
Very good. And then looking at threat landscape today versus when you started 3 decades ago, what would surprise your younger self the most?
Honestly, even if I take out the fact that my younger self would get surprised by AI and a whole lot of things that are happening today. I mean, when we were growing up, running around was a better time spent than a screen.
True.
That's how I grew up, right? We were playing more football and cricket in India, right? We play cricket. Then we were spending times on a TV screen or on a tab or something like that. But even if I leave those aside, what would surprise me and my younger self that started in cybersecurity is that we're still there. We're still, the connection between the investment in cybersecurity and protect and the number of attacks, that relationship has not really gone away. It continues to be there. And it would surprise me, because all my life I've seen people focus and invest on cybersecurity. But I think we are doing something really wrong, because cyber attacks are not going down. So I think that would surprise me, that, oh, you know what? Me coming in from 30 years ago into today and say, well, if I connect these two, the investment then in cybersecurity was low, but the attacks were high. They were not as high as now, but they were high at that point. And now that the investment is very high, attacks are also very high. So that is one thing that would really surprise me.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that, 30 years ago, I was getting my first computer, something like that, right?
You remember there used to be a virus that used to do that, PC DOS, where the characters would drop off I remember that was the first virus that came up where things would start falling down from the screen. They would
Oh
drop
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
the top of the screen. That used to be a thing of scare. I mean, you start your PC and suddenly it says PC DOS on the top, and then or MS DOS on the top, and then this characters start
For
falling
sure.
down in the screen, and you stand up and say, Bob, we got a virus.
Right, right. But I think that my younger self, I remember, this is 40 years ago. I mean, 30 years ago was a long time ago too. But I remember people talking about software piracy and securing software, and they were like, software piracy is a problem that's going to be solved, right? But everyone acted like this was a solvable problem. And I think that if everything had stayed the same, if nothing changed, then maybe that problem could have been solved. But just the entropy and the number of people involved and the different languages and the lines of code and the number of systems, I think to my younger self, I think the proliferation of technology and its advancement would have shocked me, from 40 years ago. I would not have been able to fathom, I think, how technology has changed in the last 30 or 40 years. I think it was quite a bit different. And we have so many tools today. AI, I definitely watched Terminator and those kinds of movies. So I figured that at some point in time, we'd have problems. But I did not really think about just how much it's been adopted by businesses and everything, and how fast it moves. It moves really fast. The velocity in technology and innovation is incredible. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions. One of them is about learning from tragedy, right? And you recently posted about how digital industrial organizations using OT, ICS, CPS usually shut down when faced with a cyber attack. And you evangelized a lot about OT cyber defense. What's the one thing that most CISOs in industrial organizations, especially critical national infrastructure, are still missing that could have prevented this in a time when everyone is adopting new OT cybersecurity measures?
So OT has undergone a lot of changes. I mean, one of the misnomers in the OT world is called as a para model or a Purdy model.
Yep.
The reason I call it a misnomer is that people think Purdy model has something to do with cybersecurity, and it has got nothing to do with cybersecurity, because Purdy model was about automation. It was about separating process from control and all that. And then came modified para models, and then they built in a DMZ. So if I were to think to connect into IT, and then they called out IT as something that's going to create a problem in OT, and they created, as they call it, isolated islands of excellence. Everything is changed now.
Mm-hmm.
Today, you can have a SaaS service connect to a generator, giving the business a view of whether they are generating the right amount of power that they need from the right places. Are all the generators working in real time? They can get information about, so think about pharma as an industry. Pharma depends on water. So if they have sensors and transducers that are connected, and if they can get that information, if factory leaders can get that information sitting on their mobile saying that, okay, all my water sources are working or not working, and they can immediately deploy people to get things done, that improves their ability to generate more inventory on time so that they're able to meet the sales orders and so on and so forth. Look at transportation. People want to know where the trucks are. People want to know, look at those UX haul trucks that travel. All these things are important points of breach. And what you now realize is that the Purdue model exists to make sure that you've done the right amount of automation investment and you've done it correctly. But when you look at cybersecurity, it's no longer one single DMZ. You need to think more holistically. And my input to every CISO who's working out there, and I'm sure that many of them are so smart that they have figured this out, and they're no longer dependent on the Purdue model, but they're focusing it from a cyber defense perspective. in saying that, okay, if I have so many plants across so many locations doing so many activities, this is how I'll break it down. I'm going to have cyber defense for control. I'm going to have cyber defense for supervisory actions. And I'm going to make sure that when there's a cyber attack, I don't compromise with the expense that is needed to not shut down a machine, and make sure that these isolated islands of excellence continue to operate in their excellence while the rest of the organization is battling a cyber attack. I think we need to go there. And as I said, many CISOs are already there. They just need that additional extra push to think about how can I do it, and at the same time, how can I elevate my zoning and conduiting to a level which is far more granular to implement and manage. So that's where I think what I was referring to when it came to critical national infrastructure. If I'm not wrong, or if I remember correctly, a few days ago, even the Singapore minister talked about continued cyber attacks on critical national infrastructure. Then there were the water systems that were attacked in the Americas, and many systems that people have lost control over, because CPS is the new word in OT. And CPS is something that industrial companies are bringing to on the table so that they're able to have cyber control of physical devices, right? So they're bringing in security in there. My point is, the leadership of OT needs to think that OT cybersecurity is just the beginning. The real destination is OT cyber defense, because it's not enough to only stop remote access, but it's more important to understand how can I make sure that my DCS machine is not going to shut down because there was a cyber attack. Of course, OT cybersecurity is important, and that's where the initial investments will happen. But the value that I'm trying to bring onto the table is the future where people are going to use OT cyber defense to make sure that critical national infrastructure is not affected. And by that, I mean everything. I don't mean only energy systems. I don't mean only water systems. I'm also talking about transportation. I think a few days ago, CISA reported that there is a new vulnerability on train systems. And I think microsegmentation should evolve into embedded systems so that train systems can have microsegmentation in the train. So if there's a vulnerability that you can't fix suddenly, if you have a vulnerability in the train system, you really can't fix it overnight because it needs electronic chips, transducers, and so many other things that need to change. Similarly, there are vulnerabilities in ships. There are vulnerabilities, and imagine if there's a vulnerability in the ship, which is happening in the sea. If there's a vulnerability in the sea, and if there's someone who wants to take advantage of that because they're not connected anywhere, and they come in and they make whatever things that they want to go wrong, you can cause an oil spill on the sea where it's not connected to internet at all. So, yeah, we need to think about OT cyber defense is what I believe is the next horizon.
Very good. In closing, what would be your closing comments on the corrections that CXO should embark upon to adopt breach-ready cyber defense?
The first thing that enterprises should look at is, as I said in the beginning of our discussion, they need to define, CXOs should understand that breaches will happen. And they need to work together to come up and define what would be a minimum acceptable impact, material impact that they can live with, and what would be a minimum viable digital business they can live with. And I think you said a very important point in a word that you mentioned in passing, and I sort of caught on to that when you were saying that. Today's world, entropy is really very high. The word entropy is so important. It's not uncertainty alone. Of course, there's uncertainty. It's not uncertainty alone, but it's entropy, which is actually going so high every day that people need to really come together. And before they invest into any fancy new technology, they need to put the foundations in place so that they're able to make that distinction between their organization and everybody else when it comes to becoming ready for the next cyber attack and the ability to defend it and contain it. But more importantly, I think almost the reason I mentioned those two parameters is that they define how long you can really withstand the effect of a cyber attack.
Right, right. Absolutely. What I learned from you was about minimum viable digital business, right? I think that's a really important way to think about how to think about the business, right? Because it does come down to how long can you sustain your operations before it's a material impact, right? I mean, all because you have an attack in an OT system doesn't mean that it's a material impact if your recoverability is really high, right? Or if it's
Or if you're able to contain, if your ability
to contain it, or yeah, right, contain, recover. If you can get back into operations quickly, then the material impact is lower, right? But you definitely want to know that Zone A and Zone B are disconnected so that Zone B can continue producing products or doing whatever you need to do done, and that they're not impacting each other unnecessarily, right? So, but figuring out what that minimum viable digital business is, I think, is an incredible concept that I'll take with me when I'm thinking about this in the future for sure. Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome. It has been a pleasure talking to you.